In the darkest days of the Second World War, Winston Churchill faced threats from every direction. German bombers pounded London night after night. German forces swept through Europe. And yet, years later, Churchill wrote in his war memoirs that the U-boat peril frightened him more than anything else. Not the Blitz, Germany's bombing campaign against British cities, not the fall of France, not the threat of invasion. Submarines. U-boats were German submarines, and the reason was simple. Britain is an island. Everything it needed to survive, food, fuel, weapons, raw materials, had to cross the Atlantic Ocean by ship. By the spring of 1941, German submarines were sinking those ships faster than Britain could replace them. The math was brutal. If the trend continued for just a few more months, Britain could run dangerously short of food and fuel, and that could force Britain to stop fighting. This is the story of the Battle of the Atlantic Convoys. It lasted nearly 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, making it the longest continuous military campaign of the entire war. Tens of thousands of Allied naval and merchant seamen died in these cold, dark waters, and the outcome did not depend on a single heroic battle or a brilliant general. It depended on something far less dramatic: organization, scheduling, math. But we will get to that. First, you need to understand the weapon that nearly brought Britain to its knees. To understand why the U-boat threat to Britain was so devastating, you need to picture the Atlantic Ocean in 1940. It is enormous. Roughly 3,000 miles of open water separate North America from the British Isles. Every week, many merchant ships had to cross that vast space carrying grain, oil, steel, ammunition, and everything else a nation at war requires. Germany's plan to cut that lifeline was led by Karl Donitz, the commander of Germany's U-boat force. Donitz was a former U-boat captain himself, and he understood something important. A single submarine lurking alone was dangerous, but it could only attack 1 or 2 ships before the rest of a group scattered. The real striking power came from coordination. Donitz developed a tactic called the Wolf Pack. Here's how it worked. German submarines would spread out across the Atlantic in a long patrol line, sometimes stretching hundreds of miles. When one U-boat spotted a group of ships, it would not attack right away. Instead, it would shadow the group and radio its position back to U-boat headquarters in occupied France. Donitz and his staff would then direct every available submarine in the area to converge on that same group. They would attack together, usually at night when they were nearly invisible on the dark ocean surface. The results were devastating. In the early years of the war, merchant ships often sailed independently, each one choosing its own route and speed. A lone freighter on the open Atlantic was an easy target. U-boats could pick them off one by one with almost no risk. In 1940, German submarines sank hundreds of Allied and neutral merchant ships. U-boat crews called this stretch of success the happy time. Top German submarine commanders became celebrities back home. Captains like Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, and Günther Prien racked up enormous tallies. Kretschmer alone sank more than 40 Allied ships before he was finally captured in March 1941. These men were celebrated in German propaganda. Their small boats, each crewed by around 50 men, were inflicting damage that entire surface fleets could not match. And there was a geographic problem that made everything worse. Allied aircraft could provide cover for ships near the coasts. Planes based in Britain, Iceland, and Canada could patrol the eastern and western edges of the Atlantic. But in the middle of the ocean, there was a vast stretch of water that no land-based aircraft could reach. This was called the Mid-Atlantic Gap, sometimes known as the Black Pit. It stretched for hundreds of miles. Inside that gap, merchant ships had no air cover at all. The wolf packs hunted there with near impunity. Now here's the open question that Churchill and his war planners were desperate to answer. How do you protect thousands of slow, vulnerable merchant ships crossing 3,000 miles of ocean against an enemy you often cannot see? The answer, when it came, was not what most people would expect. The natural instinct when ships are being sunk is to spread them out. Send them on different routes at different times. Make the ocean so big that the enemy cannot find them. That is what many naval officers believed in the early months of the war. But it was wrong. The solution was the exact opposite. Group the ships together, sail them in formation. That is the convoy system. and the logic behind it, while counterintuitive, had been proven in an earlier war. During the First World War, German submarines had nearly starved Britain into defeat. By 1917, losses were so severe that British leaders feared the country could be starved out. The Royal Navy initially resisted convoys, believing they were too slow and too complicated. But when losses became unbearable, the Admiralty adopted the system in the spring of 1917. Sinkings dropped almost immediately. Here is why convoys work, and this is the key insight that most people miss. The ocean is unimaginably large. The submarine's ability to spot a ship depends on the horizon, which at sea level is only a few miles away. Whether a U-boat is looking for one ship or 40 ships traveling in a tight formation, the chances of spotting them are much closer than you might think. A convoy of 40 ships does not create a target 40 times larger. It creates a target only slightly larger than a single vessel because the ships are packed together. But the advantage goes much further. When ships sail independently, every stretch of ocean contains potential targets. A U-boat cruising anywhere has a reasonable chance of stumbling across a lone freighter. But when ships are organized into convoys, the spaces between convoys become completely empty. Most of the ocean is suddenly bare. A submarine can patrol for days and see nothing at all. Meanwhile, the escorts, the warships assigned to protect the convoy, are concentrated around one group instead of scattered across hundreds of miles trying to guard individual ships. Depth charges, sonar, and lookouts are all focused in one place. Sonar is a way to search for submarines with sound, and if a U-boat attacks, the escorts know exactly where to search. Operational researchers in Britain calculated this mathematically. Operational research means using math to solve practical problems. A key figure was the physicist Patrick Blackett, who worked with the Admiralty's operational research teams. Blackett and his team demonstrated that larger convoys were actually safer than smaller ones. The perimeter of a convoy does not grow as fast as the number of ships inside it. Double the number of ships in a convoy, and you need far fewer than double the number of escorts to protect the longer perimeter. The math favored big convoys. This was not about heroic battles on the open sea. It was about applied mathematics and scheduling. The British Admiralty, working from the Western Approaches Command headquarters in Liverpool, began organizing Atlantic crossings into a tightly managed system. Ships gathered in ports like Halifax in Nova Scotia and Sydney in Cape Breton, then sailed together in formations of 30 to 60 vessels, escorted by a screen of destroyers, corvettes, and frigates. Routes were planned. Speeds were coordinated and departure times were staggered to keep the system flowing. But even with convoys, the losses kept climbing. Because the wolf packs adapted, and by 1942, the situation was about to become far worse than anyone had imagined. The year 1942 was one of the worst years of the Battle of the Atlantic. After the United States entered the war in December 1941, the U-boats found a new and almost undefended hunting ground. American coastal waters were poorly protected. Cities along the eastern seaboard had not yet imposed blackout rules, and ships sailing at night were silhouetted against the bright glow of shore lights. Donuts sent his submarines to the American coast, and the results were catastrophic. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank hundreds of ships in American and Caribbean waters. This period became known among the German submariners as the Second Happy Time. Fires from torpedoed tankers were visible from beaches in places like Florida and New Jersey. Oil slicks and debris washed ashore along parts of the eastern coast. And it was not only the western Atlantic that suffered. In the mid-ocean, wolf packs continued to attack convoys crossing the mid-Atlantic gap. Across the whole of 1942, Allied and neutral shipping losses to all causes ran into the millions of tons. In November 1942 alone, U-boats sank over 700,000 tons of shipping. That was one of the worst months of the war for Allied merchant losses. To put those numbers in perspective, shipbuilding was racing to replace what was being lost. But when you added losses from mines, aircraft, and surface raiders, the total destruction was running dangerously close to the rate of new construction. The margin was razor thin, and in some months there was no margin at all. Ships were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Churchill later wrote that the Atlantic struggle was a dominating factor throughout the war. Everything depended on it. The buildup of American forces in Britain for the eventual invasion of Europe, the supply of food for the British population, the flow of oil to keep the Royal Air Force flying, all of it required ships, and the ships were disappearing. Food rationing in Britain tightened, and planners watched fuel reserves closely. The war effort teetered on whether enough cargo could survive the crossing. In the United States, the initial response to the U-boat offensive had been slow. It took months for the American Navy to adopt convoy procedures along its own coast. Admiral Ernest King, the commander of the United States fleet, was reluctant to begin coastal convoys until he had enough escort vessels to do it properly. Critics, both at the time and since, have argued that King waited too long. The delay cost many ships, but by the summer of 1942, the Americans had organized an interlocking convoy system along the eastern seaboard, and sinkings in coastal waters dropped sharply. The U-boat fleet was growing too. So here's the crisis at its sharpest. Britain needed the convoys to survive, but the convoys were being found and attacked by wolf packs. The mid-Atlantic gap remained a killing ground with no air cover, and the number of U-boats kept growing. Something had to change, and what changed was not a single weapon or a single battle. It was a combination of technologies, intelligence, and relentless organizational effort that came together in the spring of 1943. Now let us step back for a moment. It is tempting to tell this story as a series of dramatic sea fights, and there were many brave actions during the Battle of the Atlantic. Escort captains rammed submarines. Corvette crews depth-charged U-boats in howling storms. Merchant sailors kept sailing even after being torpedoed once before. But the real turning point was not a single act of courage. It was about logistics, spreadsheets, routing tables, radio intelligence. It was about people in offices making better decisions about where to send ships and when. This was the war Churchill feared most, and it was won by organization. Several things came together in late 1942 and early 1943 that shifted the balance against the U-boats. No single factor was decisive on its own. It was their combination that proved overwhelming. The first was intelligence. At Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking center north of London, cryptanalysts had been working to break the German naval Enigma cipher. Cryptanalysts are people who break secret codes. The Enigma machine was a device that encrypted German military communications using a system of rotors that created billions of possible settings. Breaking it required extraordinary mathematical and mechanical effort. In February 1942, the German Navy introduced a more complex four-rotor Enigma key for U-boat communications. The British later called it Shark. This new system blinded Allied intelligence for much of 1942. During that blackout, convoy losses rose. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park, including Alan Turing and his colleagues, worked relentlessly to crack the four-rotor system. In December 1942, they were reading many of these signals again. The flow of decrypted signals resumed, and the Admiralty's Operational Intelligence Center, known by its initials OIC, could once again track U-boat positions and reroute convoys away from danger. But intelligence alone was not enough. The convoys still needed protection inside the mid-Atlantic gap where no land-based aircraft could reach. The solution came in two forms. The first was very long-range aircraft. The consolidated B-24 Liberator bomber, when modified with extra fuel tanks and stripped of some armament, could fly far enough to patrol the center of the Atlantic. These aircraft, designated Very Long Range, or VLR, could finally reach the mid-Atlantic gap. Even if a plane did not sink a submarine, its mere presence forced U-boats to dive. A submerged U-boat was slow, blind, and unable to coordinate with the wolf pack. A wolf pack was a group of U-boats that attacked the same convoy. Air cover disrupted the entire system of patrol lines and converging attacks that made wolf packs effective. The problem was numbers. For months, Coastal Command had been requesting more Liberators, but the heavy bombers were also desperately needed for the strategic bombing campaign against Germany. It took persistent advocacy, including from figures like Air Marshal John Slessor, who took command of Coastal Command in February 1943, to secure enough VLR aircraft to make a difference. The second solution was escort carriers, small aircraft carriers built on merchant ship hulls that could sail with the convoys themselves. These ships carried a handful of aircraft that could provide air cover right where it was needed in the middle of the ocean. One early escort carrier in the Atlantic was HMS Audacity, which helped prove the concept in late 1941 before she was sunk. By 1943, more escort carriers were entering service, and their impact was immediate. Alongside these developments, escort groups were becoming more effective through training, experience, and new technology. High-frequency direction finding, known informally as HUF-DUF, allowed escort ships to detect the radio transmissions that U-boats used to report convoy positions and coordinate attacks. When a U-boat broke radio silence, HUF-DUF operators on two or more escort ships could triangulate its position quickly. Improved radar, particularly the new centimetric sets that were harder for U-boats to detect at first, made it possible to find surfaced submarines at night or in fog. And there was one more factor. The escort groups themselves were finally being kept together as permanent teams, rather than being broken up and reassembled for each crossing. Captains and crews who trained together and sailed together developed a shared understanding of tactics. They could coordinate attacks on U-boats with the kind of efficiency that only comes from experience. All of these elements, code breaking, air cover, escort carriers, HUF-DUF, improved radar, better trained escort groups, converged in the spring of 1943. The result was dramatic. March 1943 was one of the most dangerous months of the entire Atlantic campaign. In a series of intense convoy battles, including the fights around convoys designated HX-229 and SC-122, wolf packs sank 22 merchant ships in just a few days. Losses for the whole month were severe. The Admiralty was deeply alarmed, but almost immediately afterward the tide turned. In April 1943, sinkings of merchant ships dropped sharply while U-boat losses began to climb. And then came May. May 1943 was a major setback for the U-boat fleet. In that single month, the German Navy lost about 41 U-boats, a rate of loss that was simply unsustainable. For every merchant ship sunk, the Allies were now destroying U-boats at a pace Donitz had not planned for. Convoy after convoy crossed the Atlantic with few or no losses, while the submarines that attacked them were detected, hunted, and destroyed. The combination was devastating. Convoys rerouted by ultra-intelligence avoided the biggest wolfpack concentrations. Ultra was the Allied name for intelligence from decrypted German signals. VLR liberators closed the air gap and forced U-boats underwater. Escort carriers provided air cover where land-based planes could not reach. HUF-DUF helped locate many radio transmissions. Improved radar found surface U-boats in the dark. And well-trained escort groups prosecuted contacts with steady efficiency. On May 24, 1943, Donitz made a decision that acknowledged the scale of the defeat. He ordered his U-boats to withdraw from the North Atlantic. The wolf packs pulled back. The convoy routes for the moment were open. Donitz would later send his submarines back with new weapons and tactics. The battle continued until the very end of the war in May 1945, but the crisis had passed. From mid-1943 onward, Allied shipping losses in the Atlantic declined steadily, while U-boat losses remained painfully high for Germany. New construction of merchant ships, especially the mass-produced Liberty ships from American shipyards, now vastly outpaced losses. The tonnage balance had shifted decisively. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, net shipping, the balance between new construction and losses, was barely positive. By the second half of 1943, the Allies were building ships far faster than the enemy could sink them. The immediate crisis had passed. Let us return to Churchill and that private admission. He wrote in the second volume of his war memoirs that the only thing that ever really frightened him during the war was the U-boat peril. And he was right to be afraid. At its worst, in late 1942 and early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic Convoys came closer to deciding the outcome of the war than almost any other campaign. But the solution was not a wonder weapon. It was not a single brilliant commander. It was a system. The convoy system itself, an idea proven in the First World War and applied with increasing sophistication in the Second, was the foundation. Layer on top of that the work of operational researchers like Patrick Blackett, who used analysis to show that larger convoys could be safer. Add the code breakers at Bletchley Park, who cracked the four-rotor Enigma. Add the long-range aircraft that closed the Mid-Atlantic Gap. Add the escort carriers, the improved radar, the direction-finding equipment, and the hard-won experience of escort crews who learned to work as teams. None of these was enough alone. Together they were decisive. Churchill also wrote that the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all through the war. Every plan, every operation, every strategy depended on control of those sea lanes. The invasion of North Africa in November 1942 required ships. The build-up for D-Day required ships. Beating Britain required ships. And the ships got through because the convoy system worked. Tens of thousands of merchant sailors made that system function. They were not soldiers in the traditional sense. Many were civilians. They sailed in ships loaded with fuel and ammunition, knowing that a single torpedo could set their vessel on fire. Over 30,000 merchant seamen died during the Battle of the Atlantic and the wider Atlantic War. Their courage kept the convoys moving. The industrial effort behind them was staggering as well. American shipyards, led by the mass production methods of industrialist Henry Kaiser, turned out Liberty ships at a pace that would have seemed impossible before the war. A Liberty ship was a simple, sturdy cargo vessel designed for speed of construction rather than elegance. Early in the program, it took about 230 days to build one. By 1943, the average construction time had dropped to about 42 days. At the peak of production, American yards were launching Liberty ships every day, and sometimes more than one. More than 2,700 were built during the war. This flood of new shipping was what finally overwhelmed the U-boat campaign. Even when submarines sank ships, there were always more to replace them. And on the other side, the German U-boat service suffered very heavy losses, among the highest loss rates of any service branch in the war. The Battle of the Atlantic was not decided by a single dramatic engagement. It was decided by thousands of crossings, each one a test of endurance, organization, and nerve. It was decided by people in plotting rooms moving pins on charts, by scientists calculating optimal convoy sizes, by engineers building escort carriers on merchant hulls, and by sailors who went back to sea after being torpedoed because the convoys had to keep sailing. Britain survived because someone organized the shipping schedules. That is not a glamorous conclusion, but it is the truth. The Battle of the Atlantic lasted from the first day of the war in September 1939 to the last day in May 1945. It was the longest continuous campaign of the Second World War, and it remains one of the most important stories of how organization, intelligence, and quiet persistence can overcome a threat that raw firepower alone could not defeat. If this story helped you understand why Churchill feared the U-boats more than anything else, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories from history that deserve to be remembered, one at a time. Thank you for watching.